So we'll continue on today with the endocrine system. And today we're going to get more in depth into the actual endocrine glands and hormones. Like starting today, we're just going heavy straight through all the glands and all the hormones. Part one was really just kind of an introduction to endocrine. So we'll start up in the brain with the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is often called the master gland because it controls numerous other endocrine glands and numerous other organs in the body. It's kind of the puppet master for the endocrine system that controls everything else downstream. So the pituitary gland is extremely important when we talk about the endocrine system. We call the pituitary gland the hypophysis. Hypophysis literally means like the thing that hangs below. And if you remember when you look at the brain, hanging down underneath the inferior side of the bottom of the brain, you have the pituitary gland. So that's where this term hypophysis is coming from. The hypophysis or pituitary gland is a small, kind of oval-shaped or pea-shaped, bilobed gland. What does bilobed mean? Two lobes. So when we look at the pituitary gland, we'll see that we have an anterior pituitary gland and a posterior pituitary gland. Or we'll see we call them the adenohypophysis and the neurohypophysis. We'll see that in a second. But it's got two lobes, the front and the back, or the anterior and posterior lobe. The pituitary gland, again, hangs down from the bottom of the brain, right? If you look at the inferior side or the bottom of the brain, you'll see this little pea-shaped gland hanging. And it hangs just below what part of the brain? The what? The hypothalamus. You remember you've got your thalamus, right? The right and left thalamus connected by the massa intermedia. The area underneath is the hypothalamus, and then hanging from the hypothalamus is your pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is connected to the hypothalamus by the infundibulum. That's like a narrow little stalk, right? This really narrow, pretty fragile little stalk attaches the pituitary gland to the hypothalamus. When we look at the pituitary gland, we see that the pituitary gland releases 9 important peptide hormones. 7 come from the anterior pituitary. 2 are going to be released from the posterior pituitary. The anterior and posterior pituitary are completely separate. They're anatomically different. Physiologically, their function is different. They've got different hormones. They do different things completely. But altogether, we've got 9 peptide hormones coming from the pituitary. The fact that these are peptide hormones tell us what? Do they need a protein when they travel through the blood? No, these hormones don't need a binding protein. They're already soluble in the bloodstream. Do they enter into target cells? Or do they bind outside? Outside, right? They're not lipophilic. They're peptides. They're big. So they bind outside to receptors on the outside of the target cell. So they bind to membrane receptors. Again, those are external receptors. So these peptide hormones from the pituitary gland do not actually enter target cells, right? They bind outside, and then they utilize some sort of a second messenger. In this case, CAMP, which remember was cyclic, AMP. That's what they utilize as their second messenger. That's what actually does the changes and work inside the cell, because these hormones are never going to actually enter into their target cells. So if you guys remember back from when we did neuro at the end of last semester, here again you see this rounded area that's showing you with the thalamus. And the area underneath is the hypothalamus, this kind of triangle. And then you can see this is the pituitary gland hanging below. So looking here, you see your hypothalamus. You've got your infundibulum, or your stalk, that kind of comes down and connects to the pituitary gland. And then you've got your 2 lobes, your anterior lobe of the pituitary and your posterior lobe of the pituitary. This little depression right here is the sella turcica. If you remember when we looked at the skull, the bones, when you take the top off the skull and you look down in it, you're looking at like where the brain sits. And the sella turcica is that little saddle-like depression that you see coming down just like this in the sphenoid bone in the center. And that's where the pituitary splits. It sits really nice and firm in there actually. It's supported really, really well in that area. That's why when we dissected the brains, how you didn't see a pituitary on most of them, because when you pull the brain out of the skull, the pituitary gets ripped off. It sits so firmly down in that sella turcica. So most of the brains that we dissected, you couldn't actually see the pituitary gland on them because of that. All right. So the anterior pituitary gland is the front lobe, right, the anterior or belly side of the pituitary gland. Again, we call this the adeno-hypophysis. Adeno means gland. What do glands do? Like in general, glands secrete stuff, right? Exocrine, endocrine, like whatever kind of gland it is, it secretes things, right? So produces and secretes things. And then hypophysis, again, is like the body underneath. So the adeno-hypophysis is referring to the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland because the anterior lobe actually produces and secretes its own hormones. We'll see that the posterior lobe does not produce anything. It releases two hormones, but it doesn't make them. The hormones that come from the posterior pituitary are actually made up in the hypothalamus. They just travel down axons and they're released from the posterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary does not have the ability to make anything. The anterior is actually acting like a gland. The anterior actually has cells that produce hormones. It has that ability to make its own hormones. So that's what we call the anterior lobe, the adeno-hypophysis. When we look at the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, again, we said that this is kind of like our master gland because it's controlling tons of other glands and organs in the body. The hormones from the anterior lobe tend to turn on and off other endocrine organs. So the thyroid gland, for example, is controlled by the pituitary. We've got like the mammary glands controlled by the pituitary. The testes controlled by the pituitary. The pituitary gland controls a lot of other endocrine glands. When we look at the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, it is controlled by the hypothalamus. Okay, so you remember you saw the hypothalamus, and then down here was the pituitary. The hypothalamus is going to control what the anterior pituitary gland does. It does this with releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones. Okay, so the hypothalamus makes releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones. Those releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones are going to end up going down to the anterior pituitary and telling the anterior pituitary what hormones to release. So the way that they get there, these releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones, these control factors, the way that they get from the hypothalamus down to the anterior pituitary gland is another example of a portal system. And we call this the hypophyseal portal system. Remember, the pituitary is the hypophysis. So the hypophyseal portal system. And in lab, we talked a little bit about the hepatic portal system. Right? And we said that in portal systems, the blood flows in a weird way, right? It's not artery, capillary, vein. Artery, capillary, vein. Instead, what happens with the portal system? What happens after capillaries? Not an artery. Portal veins. So capillary, then portal veins, then what? Another capillary bed. So with portal systems, you have your first set of capillaries, and then you have veins, right? Specifically the portal veins. But then, wait a minute, you have another set of capillaries, and then just normal vessels, whatever we're going to. Our point here is that we have two capillary beds interconnected by these portal veins. That's weird to connect two capillary beds to each other. That's a portal system. So what we see here is that we start up in the hypothalamus, and in the hypothalamus we'll have neurons that are going to release these regulatory factors. They're going to control or release the releasing hormones and the inhibiting hormones. So the neurons that release these releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones up here, those hormones have to enter into the bloodstream, right? And remember, nothing enters or leaves unless we have capillaries. So we have to have a capillary bed present up here in the hypothalamus for these releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones to enter into the bloodstream. Then we need to get them down to the anterior lobe of the pituitary. So we do that via a portal vein. So they'll go through this portal vein and then come down to the anterior pituitary. And then we need these releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones to actually leave the bloodstream to be able to work on these endocrine cells that are going to make hormones or stop making hormones. So the only way that they can leave the bloodstream is via another what? Capillary bed. So you've got a capillary bed up here in the hypothalamus where we allow these releasing and inhibiting hormones to enter. The portal vein travels down to the anterior pituitary. Then we have our second capillary bed where those releasing and inhibiting hormones can then leave and act on these glandular cells, and then they'll do whatever they're supposed to do. They'll start making a hormone, and they'll stop making a hormone, and then those hormones can enter in the bloodstream here, and then we gather and we go ahead and leave. A couple things. One, it's a portal system, so we have two capillary beds interconnected by a portal vein. We have these releasing factors and inhibiting factors coming from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary only. This does not go to the posterior pituitary gland. Okay, the posterior pituitary, again, is completely different. This is how we control the anterior pituitary gland. Also, when we look at these capillaries, these are fenestrated capillaries. What do fenestrated capillaries have? They have, do I have pores up here anywhere? No. They have pores present. These are relatively large hormones, right? And remember we said like the anterior pituitary gland is releasing lots and lots of peptide hormones that are pretty big, and we need a lot of them to enter really quickly. So the pores allow that to happen. Right? So the anterior pituitary gland is controlled mainly by these releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones from hypothalamus, but the anterior pituitary gland also has some negative feedback control. Remember, negative feedback is when like whatever product you release comes back and inhibits you or turns you off. And we'll look at this in a second. I've got like this all drawn out in 1 minute. But essentially it's saying like this releases a hormone, right? And this hormone comes down and affects this gland. Then this gland releases a hormone. And what the negative feedback is if we have enough of this hormone left to make it all through the bloodstream and to flow through the blood up here, that's kind of telling the anterior pituitary, look, we've got plenty. Like it's going through circulation, it's all the way back up here again, stop. We don't need any more. So that will then turn it off. So there is that negative feedback control as well. Here we see that. So there's a few kind of important things to pay attention to here. What part of the brain is this up here? The hypothalamus. What's this stalk called? The infundibulum, and that connects us to the pituitary. The anterior lobe and the posterior lobe. So there's a few things. Notice that these neurons up here have axons that stretch all the way down to the posterior lobe. This is completely different than the hypophyseal portal flow that we're looking at. Okay, that's the posterior lobe. We'll look at that in a second. This is what we're looking at right now. So up here we have these neurosecretory neurons. Okay, here's the little axon, and then look, the synaptic terminal is right there. And we have our initial capillary bed. So these neurons from the hypothalamus will release something, whatever releasing hormone or inhibiting hormone, whatever that they're going to send down to the pituitary. They'll release them by these first capillaries. What kind of capillaries are they? Fenestrated. Fenestrated capillaries have what? Pores. Pores. So this little releasing hormone enters into this capillary, and then it flows down through the portal vessels, right? And the portal vessels or portal veins, remember, just interconnect to capillary beds. There's like a little highway system because we got to get from here down to here. And then in the anterior pituitary, we have our second set of capillary beds. Okay, again, fenestrated capillaries with pores. So now this releasing hormone that traveled down here can actually leave, and it can work on these cells. Okay, say tell this cell, hey, release thyroid stimulating hormone, and then he'll release that hormone into the bloodstream, and it'll go and leave and go back to general circulation. Again, this hypophyseal portal system is only going from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary. When we look at the posterior pituitary, we're going to see axons that stretch all the way down. There's no portal vessels coming to the posterior pituitary. Okay, so we said that the hypothalamus releases factors or hormones that will go on and control the pituitary gland. We said that we could call those releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones. This is going to be so confusing. Releasing hormones cause it to release something. Inhibiting hormones inhibit it from releasing something. Okay, is that okay? It's really that simple. You're looking at me like I'm missing something. No, that's it. Releasing hormones go down to the anterior pituitary and say, hey, release this. Inhibiting hormones go down to the anterior pituitary and say, hey, stop releasing this. They're named very aptly for once. This is one case where they did not try and confuse you. Okay, so we're gonna go through like a couple pictures and charts, and I'll kind of talk you through, like write down what I write down, and we'll add whatever details to this. So here we're looking at a couple of the releasing and inhibiting hormones that end up going from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary, and then they go on from there, but we'll handle like the target organs later. When we do the thyroid, we'll talk about what the thyroid gland releases. When we do the adrenal glands, we'll talk about what the adrenal glands release. Right now, I'm just worried about this first part, the hypothalamus and the pituitary. And make sure I did not make this red, but since we're not going to have very much time for reproductive, know this first part as well. Okay? You don't have to know that, but know like that. All right, so TRH is thyrotropin. RH is releasing hormone. Thyrotropin-releasing hormone. This is telling us that thyrotropin-releasing hormone comes from the hypothalamus and travels down to the anterior pituitary. And it's a releasing hormone, so do you think it causes the release of something or it stops the release? It causes the release of something. It causes the release of TSH. TSH is thyroid stimulating hormone, which is going to go to the thyroid gland. We'll talk about what that does at the thyroid gland later, but essentially this is kind of showing you how the pituitary gland goes on to control lots of other things, right? Because here you see, like, so this one, for example, TRH from the hypothalamus comes down to the pituitary, tells the pituitary to release TSH. TSH comes down to the thyroid gland, tells the thyroid gland to release the thyroid hormones, T3 and T4. T3 and T4 then go on and affect tons of cells in your body. So this pituitary gland ends up affecting tons and tons of cells all over the body because of this kind of cascade that occurs. This here, CRH is corticotropin. RH is just releasing hormone. That comes from what organ? Where does CRH come from? The hypothalamus. And where does it go? The anterior pituitary. And that tells the anterior pituitary to release ACTH. Adrenocorticotropic hormone. Adrenocorticotropic hormone. Corticotropin. Then the ACTH leaves the anterior lobe of the pituitary, and we'll look at this later, but it goes to the adrenal glands, tells the adrenal glands to make corticosteroids. Those go on and affect a bunch of cells. Okay, so again, there's a bunch of steps involved that end up radiating out all over the whole body. Right now, I want you to realize that these releasing hormones are coming from the hypothalamus. They're traveling through the portal system to the anterior pituitary. And they're telling the anterior pituitary to release these hormones. So TRH causes the release of TSH. CRH causes the release of ACTH. here we see a few more. Oh, I didn't do gonadotropin, did I? I'm sorry, I'm so used to skipping over this right now because we normally do it in reproductive. GnRH is gonadotropin-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary. And it causes the release of FSH, which is follicle stimulating hormone, and LH, which is luteinizing hormone. Okay, and those are involved in reproduction, so they'll go on to affect the testes and the ovaries. And we can kind of leave it at that for now. Again, we're starting at the hypothalamus. We're going to the anterior pituitary gland. And the anterior pituitary gland is releasing another hormone. It goes out into the body and affects another gland. These are the last four releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones that you guys will have to know. This over here deals with something called prolactin. GH is dealing with growth hormone. So prolactin, PIH is just prolactin inhibiting hormone. PRF is just prolactin releasing factor. So let's just follow both of these down. Prolactin releasing factor. Where do the releasing factors or hormones come from? The hypothalamus. Where do they go? The pituitary. So prolactin releasing factor is going to come to the pituitary, and do you think it's going to cause the release or inhibit the release? Cause the release of prolactin. Right? Prolactin releasing factor says, hey, make prolactin. So then the anterior lobe releases prolactin. We'll see that that prolactin then goes to stimulate the mammary gland, right? Prolactin, like prolactation, milk production. So, and then you see here, prolactin inhibiting hormone, right? Do you think that's going to inhibit the release? Yes. Prolactin inhibiting hormone goes from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary, and you see this minus sign, right? It inhibits the release of prolactin. And then this is just showing you the negative feedback. So this is showing you if there's prolactin left in the bloodstream and it makes its way back up here to the hypothalamus, it's going to inhibit the releasing factor, right? Because we want to stop releasing it. We already have a bunch of it. We don't need any more. And then if we've got prolactin left in the bloodstream, it's going to stimulate the prolactin inhibiting factor. Right, again, that's just the whole point is just put on the brakes. So we've got enough of it, you can stop releasing it. This here is showing us growth hormone. Again, the exact same thing. Growth hormone, releasing hormone comes from the what? And goes to the anterior pituitary and causes the release of growth hormone. We'll talk about growth hormone, and it's got a lot of complex effects later. But essentially, growth hormone will directly affect tissues, and it works on the liver and tells the liver to release more hormones called somatometins. But again, the key point here is that the releasing hormone goes from the hypothalamus to the pituitary and says release growth hormone. The inhibiting hormone does the opposite. Right? The inhibiting hormone goes from the hypothalamus to the pituitary and says stop releasing growth hormone. We have plenty of it. Okay? So that part's pretty easy. Right? Releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones go from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary. Where do they go through? How do they get there? The portal system, the hypophyseal portal system. And then they either turn the pituitary on or turn the pituitary gland off. Now this is a plethora of info.